Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Place. I'm so happy to have you here. And every week, I introduce you to thought-provoking and compelling premier educators, politicians, whistleblowers, best-selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. And many of these people are also considered modern-day heroes, and I have one of those for you today. And they also have one thing in common. They're people of truth and integrity, and many are considered modern-day heroes. So who am I interviewing today? Well, I'm interviewing the heroic Gary Nesner. Gary was the first chief FBI hostage negotiator in history and was the original negotiator in the Waco, Texas hostage standoff in 1993, led by David Koresh. David directed his followers to commit mass suicide while Gary tried to save them. Many did die, but many or substantial amount of people also lived thanks to the efforts of Gary. So Gary, thank you so much for coming to this interview. And we've interviewed before, and it's just such a pleasure and an honor to interview you again, because after our interview, I just realized how loved you were and how respected, and that you were exactly the way I imagined that you are.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you again, and I'm almost a little set back because you painted such a great picture of me here that I'm likely to disappoint your audience. But the things you talk about, I've always been a big believer in working as part of a team, and the things that I experienced, both the good and the bad, were almost always in the team context, and just make a point of that. That for example, the 35 people we got out in Waco, that was clearly a team effort, nothing I did by myself, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And you survived to tell this powerful and historic story. And what happened in Waco was something everyone watched unfold from our televisions. And some of the events and details in your attempt to end the stand down and this horrible thing that transpired is something we're going to get into. And first, let's kind of start from the beginning. How did you end up in the FBI? Was this like a childhood dream of yours? I'm just curious how you ended up working for this agency.
Well, it was, and I outlined that in my book, Stalling for Time, and I made an error in my book. I said I was about 12 years old, but I spoke at a conference some years ago, and they gave me a videotape of the Mickey Mouse Club TV show that I watched that inspired me to become an FBI agent, and I was 8 years old. And, it just became a lifelong dream for me. When I saw J. Edgar Hoover being interviewed about chasing gangsters and spies and bank robberies and shooting the Thompson machine gun. It just seemed like such a boy's adventure to me. And for whatever reason, it stuck with me. And, going on through my education in college, I eventually was able to join the FBI. And it turned out to be that and everything more.
And also, I had heard you mention on one of your interviews that in the 70s, they were restructuring the FBI, and that appealed to you. Can you share what it was that they were restructuring and what it was that appealed to you?
Well, the FBI, these were the days immediately in the aftermath of Mr. Hoover's dying. He died actually several months before I joined the FBI. And, and the FBI was certainly at that time a little bit more open and receptive to some new ideas and capabilities. And one of those, amongst those many disciplines, was a brand new thing called hostage negotiations. And when I heard about it, it instantly appealed to me as a skill set that I wanted to gain. The thought of resolving conflict through the verbal engagement and bringing about positive outcomes really I found compelling. And it certainly did that for me. And of course, it has a lot of applicability when we're talking about interviews, interrogations, developing informants. I believe everything in life is relationships, everything. And so the better equipped you are at engaging interpersonal communication skills, the better off you're going to be.
Do you feel that you had an innate ability in understanding people prior to your training?
I think to some extent. I think, negotiations, there are some people who are naturally, intuitively quite good at it. And there's probably an equal number who will never be competent in it because of a number of factors. But most people, the vast majority of people, can improve their approach and their capabilities by making a concerted effort to become essentially good listeners. And through that, we're able to demonstrate to somebody that we're genuine, we're respectful, we're trustworthy, we want to know about them, and they in turn will then be more receptive to some of the ideas and thoughts we have to avoid confrontation or to resolve a conflict that's ongoing.
Are there women that hold your position or hold the position that you had?
Absolutely, and women are amongst the best negotiators. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm aware of any scientific studies that validate this, but I know anecdotally and impressionistically that women, I think by and large, are more empathic. And if you cast that into a crisis conflict where someone is having a standoff with the police, and they expect the police to be very authoritative, very demanding, very commanding, and then you get a very empathic woman on there, they are often, the perpetrators are more open to sharing their feelings and their thoughts and their motivations, and that can become quite an effective tool for us. So women are great negotiators, and they're better listeners, I think, generally speaking.
Well, men are the doers, and there is data and scientific articles that validate at least your perceptions. And
yeah, so I think there are, but I mean, I haven't seen a study relative to hostage negotiations, but I know. I mean, I'm a firm believer that a good negotiator is a good negotiator, and
right.
Particularly when someone's having probably the worst day of their life, which brings them into contact with my profession. To be able to devote our time and energy to coming across as non-judgmental and there to help them and not hurt them, is the key to our success. And the quicker we're able to do that, to demonstrate that we're good people. Ella, there's probably the number one attribute. I've talked about it quite a bit the last couple of years when people ask me what makes a good negotiator. It's kind of this word that everyone understands, but it's hard to define. And I just call it plain old likability.
Yes.
That person you meet at a social engagement, you've never talked with them before, and you walk away from a conversation after a while and you tell your husband or significant other, whatever, he said, I met so-and-so nice. What a nice person. What an interesting background or career or set of experiences. We should go out to dinner with them. We should get to know them better. Just really nice person. Well, what is that? How do we define that? How do we package that? But it's good stuff. And that's what you want to be,
Mm-hmm. Well, what did your training look like? What was the process of becoming an FBI negotiator? Well, interpersonal skills, I imagine, is something.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's sort of both a self-selection process where it's all volunteer. So people typically don't seek out the training unless they have some basic, proclivity to and some skill sets that they want to, enhance. And then we, as a system, we kind of look for and recruit those people that, again, have good self-control. Don't get rattled in a tense situation. My favorite quote, and I start each chapter of my book with a famous quote, and my very favorite, long before I wrote the book, was from Rudyard Kipling. And it's a partial quote. It basically says, if you can keep your head about you when all else are losing theirs. And that kind of explains in a nutshell the calm, thoughtful approach that we like to see in the kind of people that become negotiators. And it serves you very well, instead of rising to an argument and taking the bait and engaging in, tit for tat, we patiently listen and we let any attacks against us personally be like water off a duck's back. And we get that person back into, a positive interaction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And before we move into some of the incidents that surrounded Waco, can you share with us some of the other crisis negotiations that you partook in?
Oh, yeah, through the years. I mean, when I first started off, I did a lot of work with the Washington Metropolitan Police Department, and those were the more classic type of events that the police worked. A drunk individual who'd beaten up his wife on a Friday night, an employee holding their employer who, disgruntled situation, domestic arguments of all sorts. Depressed, suicidal people is probably the most common thing that police respond to. But in the FBI, we tended to respond to larger incidents like bank robbery, hostage situations, embassy takeovers, skyjackings. I did a number of those. Prison riots, I did several of those. Right-wing militia standoffs, and religious zealots. And I flew to Peru when the Japanese ambassador's residence was taken and Americans were held hostage. So, there was a fair amount of international work. I worked 120 kidnap cases involving American citizens overseas. So my unit had a pretty broad array of tasks that we were responsible for in terms of negotiations, and it gave us a pretty wide breadth of experience.
A little problem with my mute button there. Okay, so let's fast forward to the Waco incident that so many people watched and were traumatized by. I watched it, I was a child, and it was just, you watched it unfold, and the media had no idea how it was going to end. Speaking of which, were they cumbersome? Did it make it difficult to do your work with this media frenzy going on around you?
Not so much as negotiators. The media is always plays a role in large scale events. Prison riots and skyjackings. All of these are the kind of events that draw a lot of media attention. We sort of plan for that as negotiators, and in some respects, we'll try to use the media to our advantage. What I think the impact they had, say, at Waco was it creates a lot of external pressure on FBI decision makers. What's taking so long? Why can't the famous FBI resolve this situation? This is taking weeks and weeks and weeks, and that applies pressure. The reason I named my book "Stalling for Time" is because as negotiators, we know that simply buying time generally works in our favor. So we're not put off that something is taking a long time. That can often mean we're slowly chipping away and being successful. But to someone who's in charge of spending $1 million a day and hundreds of personnel to manage brought across the country to deal with the situation, the fact that it's taking so long can create a fair amount of pressure.
And some of the criticisms that I've heard after listening to many shows or viewing many shows, documentaries, is some of the things that happened with the ATF. So the ATF was there prior to the FBI's arrival, and some bad things happened there, or that weren't successful. And what was your thought on that?
Well, it began as an incident that was sparked by a different federal agency, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, was attempting to execute an arrest warrant for David Koresh and a search warrant for the Branch Davidian compound. And, as was highlighted in several documentaries and the 6-part Paramount TV series that I was involved in, the Davidians found out they were coming and were prepared for them. So when ATF arrived, a shootout was sparked between the two groups that resulted in 4 ATF agents killed, 17 wounded, and probably 4, 5, 6 Davidians killed and several wounded, including Koresh. So, eventually then the FBI very quickly was assigned to come out and take command of the incident, which is based on the fact that when a federal agent is assaulted, no matter what agency they're from, the FBI investigates it. So the Attorney General said, the FBI, you go do that. So I flew out right away, and others in the FBI as well. And but you have to put yourself now in a situation where we are arriving at the worst possible, a set of events. It's not like, hey, nothing's happened so far. We just have a disagreement. Let's talk. Let's be friends. No, we've got dead people, and we have a religious zealot leader whose prophecy is based on the end times, where the forces of evil are coming against them. And one could argue that the ATF raid was a fulfillment of that prophecy, and it only strengthened Koresh's standing amongst his very loyal followers. So, we started off in a very, very deep hole, and it was very challenging in many ways to deal with David Koresh.
Mm-hmm. Let's get into David Koresh a little bit. Who was he? I mean, we understand he had followers that were willing to die for him. He had this power over people with his charisma and his ability to manipulate people who came there seeking truth. And maybe we can talk about the Davidians themselves, because they were a break-off religion. And you know, from what I understand, he ended up, he didn't do well in school, from what I understand. He had dyslexia or some other learning disabilities. And because of this, he found the church, he found the Bible, and he took it upon himself to memorize the Bible, which he used. He quoted the Bible throughout, through instances that, of course, that you were involved with, but just he was able to quote the Bible and use that as a weapon against people.
Well, David certainly had a very dysfunctional upbringing and broken home and learning disabilities, as you suggest. But in finding his truth in religion, and as you say, memorizing large parts of the Bible, he found that he was able to sway people and impress people and gather followers and suggest to them that he had a special contact with God and, prophet, Messiah, whatever verbiage you want to use. But like a lot of the cult leaders, Jim Jones and so forth, that we read about through the years, the Bhagwan, all that, they end up abusing, I think, that control. For example, everybody had to give all their worldly goods and money to Koresh. He had exclusive sexual, access to their wives. They had to give up their wives. He controlled every facet of their lives. And these were, I think you could describe them as mostly innocent, naive people who really believed in his message. You can argue whether or not he totally believed in what he said or pretended to believe, but there's no question his followers did 100% without reservation. So, if he said jump, they said how high, and it's this worship of a cult of personality, for lack of a better term, that really becomes so damning and difficult and so challenging for a negotiation team to try to resolve.
Mm-hmm. He saw himself as larger than life. I mean, he just had that, which is kind of a personality disorder. And what was intriguing to me is he said that when he was a child, God spoke to him and told him he was the new Messiah.
Yeah. Well, and there was early on in the incident, about the third day, I believe, Koresh proposed surrendering and bringing out all his people if we would allow
that.
Pardon?
I was unaware of that.
Yeah, and he wanted in exchange for that to be able to broadcast a message nationally. Well, we were hopeful that this might lead to the solution. We didn't object to him sharing his message. We weren't opposed to his religion. We were just trying to get people out alive and resolve the situation peacefully. But we were very concerned about them committing suicide after he broadcast this message. So instead of broadcasting it live, we asked him to record a message. So he recorded a 58-minute sermon, basically articulating his view of the book of Revelations and the opening of the seven seals in the book of Revelation. And we listened to it. We didn't see anything problematic in it. We played it for religious scholars at Baylor University. They didn't see a problem with it. So again, we got reassurance from Koresh that he Freudian slip there.
I was about to say a little bit of a Freudian slip there.
Yeah, for sure. But Koresh promised, once we played the tape, he'd come out. Well, we did. And it was played by the Christian Broadcast Network, broadcast nationwide. And after it was over, we're ready to receive the children. We have a very detailed plan about who's coming out when and how that was going to be all organized. And then conveniently, God told Koresh not to come out. So, this is one of the problems we had with David all along. He would sort of change his perspective. On one occasion, he said, I'm coming out on Easter. And we said, okay. And Easter came and went. And he said, well, that's not my Easter. And we said, well, when is your Easter? He said, I'll let you know. And another occasion, he asked us to interpret one of the seals. And what does it mean? I think it was the third seal, might have been the fifth. So we got all these religious scholars to tell us this is the common, most accepted interpretation of what this seal means in the Bible. And of course, we shared that with Koresh, and of course, his answer was not even close. So no matter what challenge or position he took, if we tried to address it, he would simply change it. And it was, again, a way to control. You know, when he failed to come out after promising and God told him to wait, you know, a skeptic might believe that he got cold feet and didn't want to come out, was concerned about what fate was presenting to him. So, you know, conveniently, God told him to stay in. So, you know, it's very difficult to work with someone like that.
You know, and from what I understand and what I've read, he had been accused of murder, but it was a hung jury even prior to this unfolding.
Yeah, in 1980, I think it was 1987, there was a power struggle. Before Koresh, the Branch Davidian sect of the Seventh Day Adventists was run by a man named George Rogan and his wife. George Rogan died, and the wife took over. And even though she was, I think, in her 80s, Koresh ended up having a romantic relationship with her, and he's in his 20s or 30s. That resulted in a contest for control of the sect between Koresh and Rogan's son, George Jr. That ended up at one point in literally a shootout. And the police came in, they arrested everybody, and Koresh and others were put on trial. But he beat the charges. He was acquitted. And in fact, we used that in the negotiation effort. We said, you know, you don't want to submit yourself to civil authority. I said, but look what happened before. You did it. You got your day in court. You made your case, and you were acquitted. It shows you that the system can be fair and open to the truth. So if you feel as though ATF, which he did, if you feel as though ATF were the aggressors here, then the best solution is to have your day in court. And we also tried to appeal to him that someone like him who was trying to spread his message would probably never have a better opportunity to speak to the world than if he was on trial. So, you know, we tried so many things, Ella, to get him to come out. And, you know, as I said, we got 35 people out, including 21 children. But at the end of the day, you know, we just couldn't get him to come out. And we had some internal disagreements in the FBI about the best way to proceed as well.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that in further detail after the break. So before we go to the break, I wanted to ask another question about him. Or maybe make a statement and you can respond. So from what I understand, when he joined the Davidians at a certain point, they decided to build, was it Carmel City? Is that what they called their compound in Waco?
Yeah, I mean, my memory's getting a little fuzzy on this, but they had lived in, I think, Palatine, Texas, is where the group had sort of communally lived. And I don't know how they acquired the land, but they ultimately moved to this stretch of land outside of Waco, Texas, and begin through the years to build, you know, a large building that housed them all in a communal fashion. That building process was still going on in 1993 when the ATF raid commenced.
And I understand he took a 14-year-old wife in the beginning, but then that wasn't enough for him. So then he had many child wives, and he basically told the men that they had to practice celibacy. I can't believe they would go along with that.
Yeah, and even his number one deputy, Steve Schneider, he and his wife Judy had been married quite a long time, very loving relationship, but they could not have children for whatever reason. And Koresh even took his best friend's wife as his own and fathered a child with her. But yes, there were clearly several instances where he had, sexual relations with underage girls. What Koresh was trying to do, as we understand it, there was a group of designated people that were supposed to pass in judgment at the end times. And he was trying to create this jury as being his offspring. So, he took it upon himself to slowly build this family of children he fathered for this express purpose. Of all the children we got out, 21, none were fathered by him. He wouldn't let them go. So it was
10 other children, because I know that he released 10 children, but you noted that none of them were his children.
Actually, 21. We got 21 children out. So
21 children. Okay.
Yeah, and no small achievement, and something all of us who were involved in that were relieved and very proud that we were able to help save their lives. But many more children sadly died in the final days. And, we don't feel we've had success unless we get everyone out safely that we can. And in Waco, we did not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a break, and it's coming up a little bit longer. The other thing I would like to talk about is just the tension that existed between this tactile team, and they wanted to use force, and that's the antithesis of what you guys wanted to do. So we'll pick up there as soon as these commercial breaks are over.
Mm-hmm.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for the delay there. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Well, before the break, we were just talking about the tension that was mounting between the negotiators and the tactical teams. And the tactical team was they were tired of waiting around, and they wanted to use force. So what was going on behind the scenes, and how did this decision come about?
Yeah, I think, in any major incident, there's sort of a triad of leadership, and there's the overall on-scene commander, there's the tactical commander, and the chief negotiator. So in this particular incident, I think the tactical commander felt as though the Davidians were manipulating us, lying to us, stalling, and untrustworthy. And there certainly were examples that we all witnessed that would support that belief. But the problem we had was, in his view, we would get them to come out by applying increasing levels of pressure externally. Now, as a negotiator, I know that falls under the category of what we call the paradox of power, which is the harder you push, the more likely it is you are to be met with resistance. So the other thing we had, it unintentionally undercut the negotiation effort. For example, if you're inside, as the Davidians were, the question is, are you going to listen to the nice person on the phone who's empathic and understanding and says they want to help you, or are you going to pay attention to the guy in the tank that just crushed your car out front of the compound?
Right.
So, those are very different signals that you send. And the stronger tactical demonstrations certainly unintentionally pulled the rug out from under negotiations a number of times, and it made it quite difficult for us to get back on track.
Right. And so when was the breaking point? When did the tactical team decide to move forward? From what I understand, they had to go through, her name is escaping me. Yes, Janet Reno, and she was newly appointed.
Yeah, that was at the end. But what happened, we had gotten most of the children we got out were released in the early several days. And then we were trying to get adults, and we had a theory that we called trickle, flow, gush, that we could slowly and steadily begin to get people to come out on their own for whatever reason. And then eventually we thought more and more would come out, and perhaps even Koresh eventually. This was taking a long time, was costing a lot of money. And on one day, we had a tremendously successful day. I think, I'm trying to think of the date off the top of my head. I think it was March 22nd. So, it was probably my fourth week there. And we actually got 7 adults out. And in response to that, without coordinating with the negotiation team, without us knowing about it, the tactical team went forward and very aggressively, moved vehicles and knocked over fuel tanks. And I explained to the on-scene commander, this was the opposite of Pavlovian, where we reward for good behavior. So if you want your dog to bring you the newspaper, you give him a biscuit every time he brings you the paper. If he brings you the paper and you kick him between the legs, the dog's pretty quickly going to say, well, this isn't working out very good for me, so I don't think I'm going to do this anymore. And people really are no different. So eventually, Koresh said no one else was coming out, and then no one did. And I think after the 23rd, and I was rotated out on March 25th, and they had someone else run the team for the second half, and the heavy-handed tactics continued. No one else came out. We never got a single other person out. So it was very upsetting. Of course, the FBI defended itself publicly, but there was a clear recognition within the organization that, the negotiation approach was the proper one and was the successful one, and that the heavy-handed tactical maneuvering worked against our best interests. So after that, I was involved. I got a promotion. The on-scene commander, tactical commander, sort of their careers sort of ended there at Waco. And we began to teach every boss in the FBI and all of our 56 offices the proper way to use these two resources, tactics and negotiations, hand in glove. And that was more of a restatement of what the FBI had been doing for 20 plus years. But, I tell people Waco, the way it was managed, was actually a departure from our longstanding practices and beliefs. Our beliefs are basically, we use, and this is law enforcement wide, everybody says it, it's not maybe necessarily practiced universally, but you use no more force than is absolutely necessary. If in police work, in the FBI work, if we're forced to use force, it's got to be for compelling reasons. We have to be able to articulate in a court of law or court of public opinion that this demonstrated behavior, these statements, these actions by the perpetrator or perpetrators left us with no recourse but to take action. That's the threshold we have to meet. We can't say, well, we got tired, it was too expensive, or we're hungry, it was cold. That just doesn't cut it. You have to be able to say, we were willing to be reasonable forever, but this person forced our hand.
Did anybody during the time of the standoff, one thing I wanted to ask you, how long did the standoff exist?
Well, it went on for 51 days.
Okay. This was in 1993. I don't know if we stated the timeline.
Yeah, it started February 28th, 1993, and ended April 19th. By the way, 2 years later, that was the anniversary of when Timothy McVeigh, who showed up at Waco,
and empathized. Yeah, he was an empathizer, as well as some of these anti-government types. I understand there's a group of people that did support him because in their minds, it was like an anti-government movement.
Yeah, and Ella, and this is why I'm always happy to do interviews like this one, because people tend to have a simplistic view. You either believe that big old bad government decided to come in and kill people, and it's the terrible people in the government's oppressive and all this, or you believe that they were all a bunch of idiots and kooks and nuts and they got what they deserved. Life is more complex than that. There were good people inside who were following their religion. Yes, many were manipulated by what some would characterize as a con man in David Koresh, but it doesn't mean that they were inherently evil or bad people. And while the government worked very hard in a lot of different ways, and we did a lot of good things out there, there were people in the government that, even though they wanted to see a good outcome, probably didn't go about it the right way. So, you have to peel back the layers of the onion. Life is complex. It's gray. It's nuanced.
Complex. People are just not all good or all bad. I don't know. There are some people that are bad.
No, absolutely. And I find, it certainly creeps into our political discourse, and that's why Waco keeps coming up, because it's sort of a rallying cry for those who feel the government overreaches and is oppressive. And I see a lot of people that seem to be swayed by simplistic perspectives on complex issues, and that's something that I'm very troubled by.
And then finally, the tactical team has the last word. Wait, before we get to that, I know there was another attempt to negotiate with him. There was a promise for milk for the children. But that milk was special. That milk was special.
Well, that went in earlier. Actually, when I was still there, we sent in the milk, and we did that to try to break an impasse that we had gotten into because of some tactical action. So we knew they'd been asking for milk for the children, and Our original intent was not to give them the milk, saying instead, come out for the milk. But to break this impasse, we said we will send you in some milk for the kids, and we did that, and it helped to reopen the communication. Without consultation, the power was cut off by the tactical team, and Steve Snyder, Koresh's assistant, said, "Well, you finally send us this milk in here, and now you cut off the power, and it's going to go bad. So what are you trying to tell us?" And it was a challenging thing to have to deal with, but at the end, the FBI was left with really very little options. You either went in there.
Sorry to interrupt you, but weren't there recording devices in the milk?
I will not acknowledge that publicly.
Other people did. So maybe he is not allowed to speak on it. But from what I understand, there's recording devices in there, which help give some insight. I'll say it. You don't have to.
Well, we always try to gather information, a variety of different ways when we're dealing with people to have a better understanding of what they're thinking and planning is very helpful to us. So, but ultimately at the end, it was clear that Koresh wasn't coming out. The FBI didn't want to go in with guns a-blazing, so they came up with a plan to insert tear gas. Now, tear gas is, historically been used quite a bit in the United States. It doesn't always end up, in fact, fairly rarely does it end up in a fire being started. But the FBI did put in tear gas, and Koresh ordered, the Davidians to light the fires, and the rest is history, a very tragic and sad ending. Now he clearly made that order based on his reaction to the FBI putting the tear gas in, but those who suggest that the FBI put in the tear gas and purposely started the fires, it's just not an accurate account of what happened, and the arson investigation validates that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I understand about some of the military weapons that are deployed, and even tear gas. I know that local police stations carry them, and so I do understand that. But there were more tactics used. They wanted to make them miserable enough that they would leave the compound. They were playing loud music. They were, oh gosh, what else was it?
Floodlights. There were floodlights on the compound. We call those in the negotiation program agitation deprivation techniques. Mm-hmm. We had fought against them for since the 70s. Right. They don't work, and they're counterproductive. The playing of the audio tapes, Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Are Made for Walking" and chants of Dalai Lama, and they also played sounds of dying rabbits that hunters use to draw in coyotes at night so they can shoot coyotes. Oh. All of these things were done without the knowledge of, and once we found out, despite the objections of the negotiation team. And it's one of the most embarrassing things, because for someone who's taught negotiations all over the world, in the aftermath of this, people would say to me when I'm speaking at a conference, a negotiation conference, why did you guys do that? You guys teach against that, So I had to explain that, well, we didn't do it, but it was done, and it was embarrassing and ineffective. And, I hope we never see that again, but it's ineffective at best and makes us look foolish at worst. So.
Mm-hmm. And I know I saw it in an interview with a woman who had been one of the people who jumped out the windows after the fire started, and then there was witnesses who saw a man fall through a window and he was on fire. How disturbing.
Yeah, Ruth Riddle is the lady you told me. She's the only female that came out on that final day of the fire, and she actually tried to run back in, and one of the hostage rescue team members jumped out of his vehicle and tackled her and dragged her to safety, and very heroic act. There was, I think, someone else that had some fire on him that crashed out a window. But, I think of the nine or 10 people that survived the final day, I think all but one or two had accelerant on their clothes, which indicated to the investigators that these were probably people involved in actually starting the fires, hence their ability to survive the fires, while others were ushered into the internal part of the compound where they couldn't escape. These folks had been on the perimeter starting the fire. Very, very sad, very tragic.
Yeah, very tragic indeed. So let's talk about the aftermath. I know that there was, all you could see on the television was all these criticisms of the FBI, how it was handled, because many people believe that no one had to die, including other agents.
Well, it is funny, and I'll defend the FBI here for a moment, even though it's probably been the biggest internal critic of the FBI. The same people that said, "Why did you do that?" were the ones who were saying, "Why don't you do something?" So the public can be very fickle. Why is it taking the FBI so long? This is costing too much taxpayers' dollars. The FBI needs to just go arrest these people. They've broken the law. They killed federal agents. And then you do something and say, well, not that. So it's just kind of hard to please everyone. But I think there's certainly plenty of room for criticism of some of the FBI's decisions. I ultimately place the blame with David Koresh. He was given literally every day the opportunity, encouraged to lead his people out. And we made all kinds of concessions. We sent in milk. We sent in videotapes. We sent in magazine covers where he was on it. We promised we sent in official letters saying he could meet with his followers in jail. Every request he made, we complied with it. And yet,
he didn't comply with his promises.
Well, that's right. But at the end of the day, I think in his mind had to give up too much. He had to give up being a living God amongst his, loyal followers to go to prison. At one point in time, he said, "If I don't want to go to jail and be Bubba's love toy," thinking he'd be raped in jail. So, David typically was often mostly concerned about David. So that was, that was pretty apparent to us. But again, sadly, his followers, hook, line, and sinker, they believed every word of him. And, I learned a lot in those days about, how certain leaders, narcissistic leaders, can manipulate followers. It's a sad thing to see when for many of us, it's so obvious.
Mm-hmm. Just think about Hitler and the power he had over the German people. But I do see a predominant theme when it comes to religious leaders. To this day, maybe horrible things don't come out of it, but you just see this blind following of these leaders who aren't necessarily even decent people.
For hundreds of years, after Waco, we began in the FBI series a meeting with religious scholars so we could better understand. And there's quite a few prominent scholars about millennialism. And you go back historically, there's been hundreds of these groups, and they're typically led by this messianic, narcissistic leader who's primarily a taker. And they have often predicted an end time that when that prediction comes, it doesn't happen. And you would think that would turn off their followers, and sometimes it does turn off a few, but essentially they just change their prediction. God told me he changed his mind, or there's a different date. And it's amazing what some of these people have gotten away with and have their followers retain their faith and loyalty in them. When we were first responding to Waco, we found a tape that David Koresh had done, or actually an Australian TV station had done, where they went in the compound and actually videotaped him preaching. And for most of us educated FBI agents, what we saw in him was, something, none of us would be particularly impressed by. But you could see how he mesmerized his audience. And, for certain people that are looking for a truth, and he tells them the things that really appeal to them.
Mm-hmm. And his plan was to create an army. And he had said when he was younger that his religion would end in his death.
He was the same age as Jesus when he died, and I think he viewed himself in that regard. How much of it he really believed, Ella, I don't know. To this day, I don't know how much he really bought into the things he was saying, or was this just the vehicle through which he controlled and manipulated and conned others? What we saw in the FBI, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I didn't see a psychotic behavior. What I saw was manipulation and control. He was a very antisocial personality, as they say these days, a malignant narcissist. And, and these people can cause a lot of harm.
Yeah, they do to this day. There's been leaders who have these same characteristics. Yeah. And it's a detriment to people. And I just don't understand. I analyze this all the time. I'm like, how do people end up following these people? Why can't they see? Why are they like, it's like they're a gnat on a screen listening to something, but they need to fly back and look at the whole picture, but they're not able to discern in a manner that many people can.
Yeah, it's not an exclusive phenomenon with religion, but that's predominantly where we see it, where people, for whatever experiences they've had in life, they're looking for enlightenment. They're looking for, why are we here? What is this life about? And, a talented, well-spoken individual can provide answers to the questions they have. And so religion is a particularly, we saw it with Jim Jones, 900 people drank the Kool-Aid. Amish and Rikio, Heaven's Gate, all these different outfits. It's all parallel. There's always an exploitive leader running the show.
And controlling people, and that's feeding their narcissism. They have to be fed, and that's one of the best ways to do it.
It's always been tough for me to understand how someone becomes susceptible to that, but clearly they do.
Yeah, it's a very sad thing. But luckily, I think people are becoming more savvy through the internet. They're able to educate themselves and think a little more critically. And I just hope that as humanity evolves, we will not fall prey to some of the things that happen that we've been so gullible and naive about. I mean, in a way, your innocence is robbed. And watching what happened at a young age, that robbed me of my innocence because I, even during that time, I thought all people were good. I just had this naive rose-colored glass of the world, and I go, oh, they're just trouble, but they're all good, everybody. And I did find out when I was 20 or so, that it's really not that way. There's something wrong with some people's minds. And now that they've scanned minds of sociopaths and narcissists, there's parts of the brain that hold empathy or that control empathy and feeling, and it's completely dead.
Yeah. I don't want to turn political, but we've certainly seen some political figures that sort of manifest those attributes, in these current times. But yeah, it's a difficult phenomena to deal with, and how do we get people to think for themselves and to use the information that is so broadly available now, and religion just seems to be very easily manipulated by so many for whatever purpose they want. And, it's us against them, and we believe this and they believe that. I mean, it enabled Hitler to kill the Jews, and you make a scapegoat and an enemy. And it's sad when you see that done. And I see it done contemporaneously, and it bothers me. How we demonize our enemies, and instead of saying, well, let me understand what you're thinking and how you feel about this. I probably won't end up agreeing with you, but I'm open to hearing what you have to say. I want to learn your thoughts on this and your perspectives, and that's a much better approach than simply discounting offhand something that they're saying. I mean, It's like this QAnon thing. I mean, it's probably the most dramatic example of a really bizarre belief system, yet there's millions of people in this country that believe it.
Well, it started out as a propaganda machine. You have like the Israeli government, certain aspects of it, the intel part, and they controlled so much of it. I found a brochure, and you can pay for their services, and they will send out algorithms. Everything's algorithms. They can create all these stories, and a lot of the stories are aligned with David Steele. I'm not sure if you know who he is. I mean, I spent thousands of hours researching it, and people don't necessarily like what I have to say. And everybody that Trump appointed played a part in his victory, and played a part in some of the dirty things that happened. And it was just pure propaganda. There's a whistleblower. She went by Snow White, and she started leaking information, which I got my hands on, which was like thousands of emails that I've read. And it's just really interesting. There's so many moving parts, so many sections. It's just, I have it on my wall. I created this huge map of how it went, and it took me a long time to figure it all out, but it was for nefarious reasons. And if Donald Trump had a problem with somebody, they got fed into the algorithm. Oh, Hillary is a blood drinking person, and then he had problems with Anderson Cooper, and then all these crazy stories happened or were created around him. He actually went to CNN and said, "This is just not true. There's no basement in this home," and so these lies are starting to fall apart. But the followers and the believers still believe.
To me, it really doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, but if you're a person that wants to understand and, use the available information, ask questions and seek knowledge. Don't ever simply accept something, particularly if it sounds a little bit wild, just because somebody told you. I mean, do your own homework and read about it. And I don't know if we become intellectually lazy or whatever, but people just want to believe a simplistic charge if it validates what you already believe.
We only have a minute, and I want to talk about your TV show that you've been working on that I believe you're so proud about, and about where people can get your books, and talk about your website, where they can learn about you.
Well, my website, it's www.garynesner.com. Noesner is how you silent O. But yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff on my website, podcast interviews and articles I've written, and and there's I was involved in the Paramount